Okay, so this first question, this is a follow-up question from our last listener submitted question from Scott. So we sort of read the first half of his question last time, and this is the last time we recorded, which was 2 weeks ago. So it's a little confusing, but carry on from Scott's question. So Scott had a question on VO2 max, and his question is, what would be some signs that someone has a naturally high VO2 max without being tested? First example I can think of is, what disadvantage does Drew have over Dylan given Drew's poor VO2 max? Sorry, Drew's not here. I know that was supposed to be funny, but Drew's not on, so he can't rebuttal this one. What would be the best approach to maximizing one's VO2 max potential if someone was just getting into cycling and they found out their VO2 max was higher than Drew's? Man, another dig at Drew. So kind of getting at some questions here, basically just on VO2 max, recognizing potential and how to live up to that.
It's so funny because he doesn't have a poor VO2.
Yeah,
it's not like it's
dude,
40.
I want to defend Drew because I feel like he does it to himself. I don't know. Well, if we make fun of his VO2 max, it's only because he made fun of his own VO2 max. But
right.
His VO2 max is elite level.
Correct.
Just throwing that out there. So if you're like, oh, dude, Drew's VO2 max is terrible and mine is worse than his, like mine must be really bad. No, he's got an elite level VO2 max.
Yeah.
And also, like, he didn't even properly test it. So there's that. Yeah, as far as like signs that you've got, I think I remember the first part of this person's question last week. And I feel like this person is trying to get us to say, well, if you've got a low VO2 max, then you might be more out of breath when you're doing efforts. That's probably not going to be the case unless it's like unhealthfully low, which I don't think is the case if you're actively training. More than likely, you're just going to be at a lower fitness level. I think one thing to keep in mind is that you can kind of think of your lactate threshold as a percentage of your VO2 max, and you could think of the VO2 max as the ceiling, but oftentimes elite level riders, they may not even have a higher VO2 max than sub elites, but their threshold is at a higher percentage of their VO2 max. So a sub elite rider might have a threshold that's 87-90% of their VO2 max. That would be pretty good. And then like some of the best in the world, they might have a threshold that's 92, 93, maybe as high as 95% of their VO2 max. So I don't know if that really answered the question, because I think the answer to the question is I don't know if there's telltale signs like you're out of breath. I don't think that's the case.
Yeah, I mean, I would say one easy way to determine someone has a high level of VO2 max is just, what we call like natural ability. If you have that friend or that person in your group ride who just started riding and they're keeping up with the seasoned veteran cyclists or, athletes with very little training, very little experience, that's pretty telltale sign that someone has a good level of VO2 max, that they can accommodate higher training or higher loads than the average person, or someone who just like adapts super well. If you see someone that's just starting and they're rising through the rankings pretty quick, or you're seeing their fitness level skyrocketing early into training, that's usually a pretty good sign that someone has a higher level of VO2 max. But that's not always the case. Some people adapt super quickly and still have a relatively average VO2 max.
Also, sometimes we talk about VO2 max as if it's fixed, and I think that's because in elite level cyclists, it more or less is fixed because they've trained their VO2 max to its ceiling, and it doesn't go much higher than that. But if you're untrained, you can absolutely raise your VO2 max. Your VO2 max is not fixed for everyone. It's trainable, but it's only trainable to a certain point, which is why a lot of times you hear elite level cyclists talking about it as if it's fixed.
Right. And if we're talking relative VO2 max, you can also skew your VO2 max score by changes in body composition or changes in overall body mass, because it is a function of body weight.
Yeah.
So let's see. So going back to Scott's question here, what would be the best approach to maximizing one's VO2 max potential if someone was just getting into cycling and they found out they had a high VO2 max?
So you don't need to do something to maximize your VO2 max potential. Like, you don't need to do, like, if you were to find out that you have a naturally high VO2 max, you wouldn't need to do something special. At the end of the day, you just need to do proper training that would apply to that advice would apply to everyone, to be honest with you. You just need to do proper training, and that's how you maximize your potential, whether you have a high or a low VO2 max. So everything we talk about on this podcast, periodization, polarization, doing enough zone 2, getting in the right intervals, getting enough rest when you need the rest, all of that applies to you if you are a individual with a high VO2 max or an individual with a low VO2 max. You want proper training. That's how you maximize your potential.
Yeah, I totally agree. You wouldn't do anything special. Like you said, it's almost like your fitness level. If you get better, like if you naturally through training raise your VO2, you're just setting the bar higher. And all of your zones are moving, all of your workouts are getting more challenging as you're getting better. Same thing if you have a higher VO2 than somebody else, you're still doing the same training, just on a different level.
Yeah, so I would throw one additional thing in there and say, if you want to maximize your VO2 max potential, you should be getting a lot of experience as well, because everyone also knows that person who's got really good fitness but can't race their bike. They don't know positioning, they don't know tactics, they don't understand, they're not good at drafting, they have no bike handling skills, things like that. So if you want to maximize your potential, then the better you can get at the craft of bike racing is going to allow you to actually use that potential, because not every single race is going to be an uphill time trial where it's just a matter of a function of fitness.
Mm-hmm.
I was thinking about it too. I guess a way to tell if you have a high VO2 is do an aerobic activity that you're not super efficient at. I guess swimming and like skate skiing would be hard because it's super technique based, but like if you're just naturally a really strong runner and you're not doing run training, like that might be a sign.
I mean, if you're really that curious, you can get your VO2 max tested. It sounds like this person is very curious about their VO2 max, and I would suggest, if you're curious, get it tested.
Yeah. All right, let's move on to Tim's question here. So the question's pretty long, so bear with me. Hi, Matchboxers. I started listening to your podcast last fall and love it. It's been a huge help in understanding training basics. I'm 38, weigh 56 kilograms, and mostly have done unstructured training, commuting with some hard efforts, weekend mountain bike endurance rides, and average about 10 hours per week. I don't run or do other workouts. Recently, I completed a 3-month block training plan by Coach Dean Golick. I followed about 80% of it, but skipped recovery rides for dirt jumper sessions at an indoor bike park. Sick. My Garmin showed high heart rate and anaerobic benefits, but I'm cutting out DJ rides this month to focus. Not sure. Oh, dirt. I thought he was referring to you, but he's referring to dirt jumping rides. That was confusing. Despite the plan, I don't feel my fitness or FTP has improved. Intervals .icu shows my FTP dropped from 240 to 233 watts. I tested my training in a race, but it did not go well, partly because I was stuck on a single speed due to shifting issues for the entire 50 miles in icy cold conditions. I felt I was almost destroyed, averaging normalized power of 197 watts for 3 hours. And then he attached some pictures, but I did not include those in this, sorry. For context, last year I was able to complete a 3-hour gravel race at 220 watts normalized and win a 109-mile gravel race in 6 hours and 40 minutes at 183 watts normalized. I have Barry-Roubaix, the 100-miler, on April 13th, which is 5 weeks away. So right now it's actually more like 4 weeks away. My plan is to focus on FTP for 4 weeks. 2 hard FTP sessions plus endurance rides. Should I do the hard sessions back to back or space them out? Or should I focus on something else? I also want to do a 50-mile gravel race on March 22nd. That's 2 days from now. And 100-mile road ride 1 week before Barry-Roubaix. Lastly, why isn't my FTP/fitness improving? So he attached some data for reference, which actually was very extensive. A lot of data in there. Apologies for the long email. Just wanted a clear picture of what I've done. Any advice would be greatly appreciated.
I mean, there's so many factors that could be affecting this.
Yes.
Did you comb through the data and find anything or no?
I started combing through the data. I mean, nothing really that stood out.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I mean, yeah, it's a lot. There's a lot of things that could be affecting. I start out with that because I mean we could spitball here, but I mean the list is practically endless.
He's 38, 56 kilos. That's like roughly 125 pounds. He said he dropped from 240 to 233 following this plan. When he was at 240, that would have been 4.3 watts per kilo. And not saying that this is his case at all, because I obviously haven't looked through all the data and everything he attached. But the first thing that comes to mind that I think is kind of danced around in other situations is he's 38. Like if he's only been cycling for 2 years, I'm sure he's got more. But if he's been cycling for 2 decades and proper training for 2 decades, like I said, I don't think that this is necessarily his situation, but like that might be his genetic potential. Like sometimes it's all you got. And that's like, you've got to figure out how to find other ways to win the race. Like we all have said multiple times, like having the higher FTP is not what's going to win you the race.
Yeah, and 38 would be the age that you start to see declines in performance. And I want to say that with the caveat that Caitlin said, which is that depends on how long you've been training. If you've only been training for 2 years, you shouldn't see a decline in performance at 38 years old by any means. Mm-hmm. But if you've been training your whole life, like since you were a teenager, absolutely you will probably see declines in performance at 38 years old.
Yeah, especially, Tim mentions averaging 10 hours per week. Now, I understand that, he says a lot of the training was unstructured, but you're still accumulating a pretty solid foundation of aerobic base training there. So, it's not like he was doing nothing. It's if let's say you've been training for 10 years, but it's only been at 5 hours a week, and all of a sudden you jump up to 10 or 12 hours a week, yeah, you could probably still see some improvements, even if your potential genetically is on the decline. But he's not doing a low. I mean, that's a pretty decent amount of training per week.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So yeah, I mean that's what my answer was also going to be. Was I wonder if it's not so much that the training was not necessarily effective, but if he's just at that point where he's starting to see some decline. Another thing too, I mean, Tim doesn't share how tall he is, but 56 kilos is on the leaner side for male athletes. So, there's a possible option of maybe trying to build some body mass on and see if that helps to, get you to the next fitness threshold. Maybe worst case, you end up evening out where your power to weight stays the same, but you have more raw power, which would be a positive thing. But you also have to make sure that you're not doing things that detriment your performance while you're in amidst a 3-month training plan here. So like if you got to make sure like you're not trying to get lean or cut weight or anything like that while you're doing this hard training. So if you were lacking on the nutrition side of things, it's possible that even though you're doing what would be quote unquote effective training, you're not actually getting the adaptations that you should be producing from that training.
Yeah, we can talk about his training going into Barry, which is now, I think that's now 3 weeks away. He said he wanted to do.
Actually, wait, before we do that, one more thing. Dirt jumping is super fun, and I advocate for that. But if over the course of 3 months you end up not having any recovery days because all of your recovery rides are replaced with dirt jumping sessions, which inherently, like, dirt jumping is gonna, you're gonna have spikes in heart rate and effort. Like, it's not, dirt jumping is not just a passive activity. There could be a possibility that you're actually getting into a state of, a little bit state of not necessarily overtraining, but, chronic fatigue, just because you're not giving your body enough rest. So that's something to consider. I know dirt jumping is super fun, and it's probably an activity that is restorative mentally, but it may not physically be giving your body what it needs on those rest days. Sorry, Caitlin.
Oh, no, that's a good point. Yeah, so Barry's 3 weeks away now. He asked if he should do his 2 hard FTP sessions back to back. I wouldn't do that. He also said that he was going to do a 50-mile gravel race in a couple days and then a 100-mile road ride 1 week before Barry. Yeah, my number one advice would be you can't expect to race your bike for 6 hours if you're not at least riding your bike for 5 hours. So getting in a couple, an opportunity to test the legs in a couple days with a 50-mile race and then a 100-mile road ride. Keep that hopefully pretty chill since it's a week before. Yeah, I don't think you need to do anything special. I don't think you should stack at least not this close, stack your hard sessions consecutively.
Yeah, I would agree. I think the only thing that he said there that raised an eyebrow was, should I do my threshold sessions back to back, just like you? I was like, no, don't do that. But other than that, I didn't see an issue with what he said.
Yep, I agree. And the last thing that I would add here is don't let this get you too psyched out. Sometimes you can actually psych yourself out by overanalyzing the data and stressing over the fact that you've seen, theoretically, based on intervals.icu, it's not even from a fitness test. They're just analyzing some of your recent data. You see a 7-watt decrease in FTP. That's nothing to necessarily be concerned about. If you start seeing a huge drop off and you just start not being able to execute your workouts at the proper intensity and things like that, that's more concerning. But a theoretical 7-watt decrease in FTP, I know it's disheartening because you went through this 3-month training block and you were hoping to see some improvements throughout those 3 months. But 7 watts, I mean, your FTP could fluctuate by 7 watts any given day just based on how you feel. So I wouldn't get too worked up about that. I would still, train as if you would normally be training for Barry Bay. Don't do anything crazy and go out there and race it like your FTP is, unchanged. I mean, you don't want to, I wouldn't change anything just because of the 7-watt decrease theoretically in FTP.
It really makes me curious about what that 3-month block looks like. Maybe you just haven't had the recovery to actually absorb the training that you did. And 7 watts could just be a sign of compounding fatigue over that 3, especially if you, like you were saying, the dirt jumping sessions replaced all of your recovery rides. Yeah.
Yep. Okay, let's move on to this last question here. So this question comes from Quincy. It's about reverse periodization. Quincy says, hello, I am 22 years old and my A event this year is extremely hilly, 50-mile ultra marathon in the middle of May. My goal is to finish the race in 13 to 14 hours. I am usually a biker, but I'm mixing it up this year. I'm wondering if for training, a reverse periodization approach is the best idea. I know that as we approach an event, we want our training to become more specific to the event, so I was wondering if I should start a VO2 max or threshold block now, and then transition into tempo block as I get closer to the competition. Or would a normal base period be the best option, then increase intensity as I get closer to the competition? Thanks, Quincy.
Now that you're a runner, Adam, you're just willing these questions into existence.
I know, right? Yeah, so for clarification for everyone, Quincy is talking about a 50-mile ultra marathon running race. So that's why it's going to take 13 to 14 hours. In 10,000 feet of vertical gain across 50 miles. So that's pretty hilly.
Okay, I might have missed it. Where the reverse periodization, where does that come in here?
Yeah, so Quincy's wondering if, traditional periodization for everyone would be starting at lower intensity during the base season, and as you get closer and closer to your event, you're starting to increase the intensity of your training. So doing shorter, harder efforts. Quincy's wondering if for this event, if he should start doing a VO2 max or threshold block now, and then as he gets closer to the event, transition into more tempo-esque training to kind of, resemble the efforts of the race.
Yes, I really like it, especially for running. I think if you even do if you do a bunch of speed work, if you do a bunch of shorter distance races like 5Ks, 10Ks, but you're still building your long run. I think back to high school when my coach put me in a bunch of short races before trying to PR in the 2-mile. And he's like, you're going to do these 800s, you're going to get really good at them, and then you're going to feel like you're walking when it comes to the 2-mile race. And that was the case. So if you still are building that aerobic base, you're still building your volume, but doing your speed work now, I think that's only going to help you later. So, and you're right, your training should get more specific. So later on, you should be doing a lot of your runs on trail. You should drop the intensity and not really do things over race pace as you get pretty close to the event.
Yeah, I would say I agree. I think that I'm not opposed to reverse periodization, although I will say I've never once done reverse periodization in my life myself. And I don't think I usually prescribe it either. But like I said, I'm not necessarily opposed to it. There's only one study that I can recall that actually addresses this head on to try to see if reverse periodization or normal periodization is better. And it was a 3-month study period, and they had 3 groups: reverse periodization, normal periodization, and then just mixed. Mixed was like they do anything at any time. And they would, I think the 3 intervals that they had them do was 4 by 16 minutes, 4 by 8 minutes, and 4 by 4 minutes. Now these are maximal. So obviously 4 by 4 minutes is going to be at a higher intensity than 4 by 16 minutes. But 4 by 16 minutes, you're doing it for a longer amount of time, right? You're doing it for over an hour. Whereas 4 by 4 minutes, that's only 20 minutes of intense work in the workout. So normal periodization would be 4 by 16, 4 by 8, 4 by 4. Reverse periodization would be 4 by 4, 4 by 8, 4 by 16, and then mixed is like, it's just all random. What they found was that normal periodization performed the best. Second was reverse, and the worst was mixed. Mixed performed the worst out of all of them.
What was the performance test?
I mean, I want to say it was like, I don't know, maybe a 20-minute test or something, or, testing their blood lactate during a ramp test, or maybe they tested their VO2 max. I'd have to go back and look at the study. They tested multiple things, but they didn't test them over like a 5-hour period or a 10-hour period. Or how long did he say it's going to take? 13 hours?
Yes, yeah, 10 to 13 hours or something like that.
They didn't test over a 10 to 13 hour period. And also, it's just one study, so it's not conclusive by any means. It is just, when anybody asks about reverse periodization, I would say that's like the only, and I have to go back and look at it because it's been a long time since I've actually done the research on this. I made a video about reverse periodization. That's really the only study that hits this question head on. Like, is reverse periodization better than normal periodization? It's actually surprising how sparse the research is on this.
Yeah.
I think it's totally context based. The only way reverse periodization makes more sense is if it's applicable to like at the end of that training, you're closer to specificity of what you're doing. So like reverse periodization, you're starting with higher intensity, you're working backwards, you're working towards higher volume base mileage. And if that fits the demands of the event that you're doing, then it makes sense.
Yeah.
Not necessarily that reverse periodization is going to make you better than standard periodization.
Yeah, and I think there's some caveats as well in that higher intensity training is hard to execute effectively if you're not fit enough to do so. So depending on someone's ability level coming in, they may not be prepared to get the effective adaptations out of doing a VO2 max training block if they're just starting, whether that's coming off the off season, and having relatively low fitness for their abilities, or someone that's just new to the sport. To have someone just go out and say, all right, go do, 8 weeks of a VO2 max training block, that may be really challenging for them to handle and, let alone execute effectively. So I think there's that aspect to it as well. And that's where I'd be curious to see, the study that you're referencing, what's the context for the athletic background of the athletes that they're putting through these protocols. How much training do they have? How much, what's their relative fitness coming in? And then ultimately to see what the performance test is at the end of the study. But that's where I agree, though. I think the context of what you're training for really does matter a lot. And also, it can look different for two different athletes doing the exact same event. Dylan, you training for Unbound is going to look a lot different than someone training for Unbound to try and finish before the sun goes down in 16 hours or whatever, right? Because you have to meet the demands of your race within the race. They're meeting the demands of their race within the race. So you may need more sharper VO2 max type efforts coming in to respond to attacks, to make your own attacks, to, get up and over hills at a hard pace, and be able to sustain that for, on and off for 9 hours. Whereas someone else that's trying to just, get to the finish line in under 15 or 16 hours, they may be, they may succumb more to steady state, high endurance or low tempo efforts consistently. So they may not need that, those repeated VO2 max efforts coming in. So you can't just look at what is the race. You have to look at what is your race. How are you training for that race? How is the outcome of your race going to play out relative to, what you're training for or how you're training.
Yeah, totally.
And I think that's where, it can be tricky when you see these universally applied, hey, go buy this Unbound training plan that's 12 weeks long. That just can't apply across the board to everyone because it's totally context-based. Maybe it applies to 80% of people, but there might be 20% of people that are outliers and aren't going to benefit from that exact plan.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I would give it a try. I would give reverse periodization a try. I think that the odds that it's like a magic bullet are really low. So for example, not to pick on Drew, but Drew's big change to his training this year was that he was going to do reverse periodization, and I think it's definitely worth him giving it a try. And maybe he'll prove me wrong, and he'll like completely crush me at Unbound. But I don't think reverse periodization is a magic bullet for like if you're, for example, if you're hitting a plateau and you're like, well, this year I'm going to do reverse periodization. I think the odds that is going to break you through a ceiling are slim, in my opinion. Yeah, I don't think it's a bad way to train. I just don't think that it's like like I don't put reverse periodization on the same pedestal as block periodization, if that makes sense. Like block periodization,
or
I think
polarized training versus something else. Yeah,
exactly. Like I think block periodization could break you through a ceiling. I think the odds that reverse periodization does that are slim, but you can certainly make the argument that it could actually be more specific to your event if you're doing an ultra endurance event. I will give you that.
The number one reason I prescribe reverse periodization is if an athlete says, we have really hard winters and I hate the trainer and I'm not going to ride the trainer more than 8 hours a week. But come late spring, I can ride 15 plus hours outside. Well, if you're only going to ride 8 hours, then let's do reverse periodization so that those sessions can be intensity sessions and get the most out of them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree. I also tend to put a lot of my athletes that are training for Leadville through more or less a reverse periodization approach. It's a little bit different because Leadville's so late in the season that you have time to go through multiple training phases. Like you can go through an entire periodized training program and then start another one. So you have time to go through everything. But still, nevertheless, a race like Leadville is unique in that you're pretty much never going to use power above threshold in that race. Like you just can't. It's just not physically possible for most people. So it makes a lot of sense to come in with more time in zone at tempo and threshold than it is to come in with a high, maximizing your VO2 max. So a lot of times for them, I'll touch on VO2 max earlier in the season. So, the traditional periodization approach would have you doing like a VO2 max or anaerobic block coming into race day. That, to me, I just don't think that's super relevant for Leadville. So a lot of times coming to Leadville, it's the opposite, where we've already done our VO2 max training, we've done some anaerobic training, but coming in, we're doing more like steady state threshold or tempo work. And that's specific to Leadville. And it's really just because you're at altitude and you're just totally governed the whole day. So, like those athletes, I have some athletes that are probably listening to this, and to me, it makes sense to come in with that approach where the specific training is lower intensity than some of the training we've done earlier in the season. But I agree, Caitlin, a lot of times I'll do it just because of the confines of winter training. One thing I will say though, so going back to, is it Quincy? Sorry, I closed the email. I believe it's Quincy, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so going back to Quincy's question here. So I do think there's something different about running intensity versus cycling intensity as it comes to form. So like in technique. On the bike, like cycling is a pretty unique activity in that your form, your technique doesn't change a whole lot when you're going easier versus hard. But in running, it does. Like your stride length changes, your cadence might change, your overall just form might change as you're doing faster, harder, intense efforts. So I do think that, like you were talking about, Caitlin, that's part of why I think your coach was having you do like some of those shorter, faster, sharper efforts, is like to just build that form into your technique, and then hopefully that carries over into your longer distance events. So even if you're not doing a reverse periodized approach, a lot of people, I think, when they're coming into ultra marathon training, and this is like just from me doing research, because I'm trying to train for an ultra marathon right now. A lot of people make the mistake of just not doing any high intensity because they see race day as an event that's never going to touch high intensity efforts, right? They're either going to be hiking up the hill or, walking up a hill, or they're going to be running at endurance pace, maybe tempo at the best. So they just totally neglect any type of speed work. And I just think that's a detriment to your overall technique and in running form. And you're missing out on some potential improvements just by improving your form and technique. So for Quincy here, I think, whether you decide to do this reverse periodized approach or not, making sure that you have some training that's, stride work, having, high intensity, very, very, very high intensity. We're talking like, almost sprint work here. Having that mixed into your training, I think, is going to be beneficial no matter what.
Oh, and please train downhill running, because that can break your race for sure if you're not used to it.
Yeah.
10,000 feet, you know, what goes up must come down.
That's 10,000 feet down. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. All right. Anything else to add for Quincy?
I don't think so.
It.
Okay. Do you guys want to do one more, or you want to call it there?
Let's call it.
Okay.
I got a ride to do.
All right. Sounds good. We'll see you guys next week.
See ya.
See ya.